This is the Regular Pastor Podcast, a podcast devoted to regular pastors and regular churches. My name is Landon Coleman. I'm a regular pastor at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Odessa, Texas. Welcome to Season 5 of the Regular Pastor Podcast. We're talking about books, we're thinking about ideas, and we're relating those books and the ideas in the books to the day-to-day ministry of regular pastors like me and like you. The book that I want to talk about today is one of my absolute favorite books that I've read over the last couple years. It's titled Spiritual Gifts, What Are They and Why They Matter? The author is Thomas Schreiner. This is a B&H book. It came out in 2018. It's 172 pages. It's just kind of an average size book, average size format, average size length. There's an introduction. There's an epilogue at the end. There's 11 chapters in the middle. And I would just make a distinction in the outline of this book and the 11 chapters that make up the guts of this book. 4 of those chapters deal with spiritual gifts in general. Chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. 7 of these chapters, 1, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, deal with the more controversial issues surrounding spiritual gifts. So let me tell you a little bit about Tom Schreiner. He is a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He has served there at Southern since 1997. He holds a chair for the James Harrison Buchanan Professor of New Testament Interpretation. He has a BS from Western Oregon University, an MDiv and a THM from Western Seminary, and then he has a PhD from Fuller Theological Seminary. Dr. Schreiner has written many commentaries, many works of theology, and I don't mean small little popular level books like the one we're talking about today. He's a prolific writer. He's a legitimate New Testament scholar. He's a great professor. I had Dr. Schreiner for Greek syntax and exegesis at Southern Seminary, and it was a tremendous class. What's the big idea of this book? I think you find it on page 1 in the introduction. Schreiner sets out and he says, I wanted to write a small book on spiritual gifts because I support a position called, quote, cessationism. At least it's a kind of cessationism, he says. So in this introduction, Schreiner says we're going to talk about cessationism as it relates to spiritual gifts. This introduction is classic Schreiner. He admits that he could be wrong. He says really smart people disagree with me. This is a debated issue. He says he doesn't want to be divisive or contentious, but he also wants to stake out his position, and he wants to make his case in a kind but convincing way. When you leave the introduction, you go to chapter 1. Schreiner borrows from J.I. Packer. J.I. Packer wrote a book many years ago, a helpful book called Keep in Step with the Spirit, dealing with the question of charismatic theology and practice. And so this opening chapter, he just kind of borrows some of Packer's ideas. He lists out 10 positives about the charismatic movement. He lists out 10 negatives relating to the charismatic movement. And then there's 4 chapters that are just kind of basic. They're not unhelpful. They're not unimportant to the book, but they're just kind of basic stuff about spiritual gifts in general. And then when you get to chapter 5, Dr. Schreiner actually gets to his argument and his discussion about cessationism. So let me just try to summarize his argument with a couple of big ideas and a couple of observations from the book. First of all, he talks about prophecy. It's an interesting place to start. You would think he might jump into miracles or speaking in tongues, but he actually starts with prophecy, and I think it's a brilliant place to start. Schreiner's argument, I like, is that prophecy is the same in the New Testament as it is in the Old Testament. There's no compelling reason to think that it's different. Schreiner says a prophet in the Bible receive spontaneous revelation from God that they are then charged to communicate to God's people. We assume in the Old Testament, just like in the New Testament, it is the same infallible, authoritative word that came to Isaiah or Elijah or any of the prophets who were active in the earliest days of the church. Here's a note just to keep in mind. Continuationists, people who still believe all the gifts are active today, they allow for error in New Testament prophecy. They make a distinction between the two. And on page 119, Schreiner just admits or recognizes that what continuationists call prophecy, cessationists call impressions. Now, you may quibble with the words, but he's basically saying, look, the moment you allow for error in prophecy, you're changing prophecy from what it was in the Old Testament, and there doesn't seem to be any biblical case to make that change. So Schreiner's argument, based on Ephesians 2:20, is that prophecy has ceased. The church is built on the foundation of the apostles, New Testament apostles, and the prophets. And the order of those words suggests that he's not talking about Old Testament prophets and then New Testament apostles, but first apostles and then prophets, both of whom were active in the early church, but none of whom are active today because the foundation of the church has been laid. Secondly, Schreiner talks about speaking in tongues. His argument, I think, is pretty straightforward. He says in Acts, it's clearly language. People could understand it. In 1 Corinthians, it's clearly language because Paul says that tongues needs to be translated and that when it's translated, it's functionally equivalent to prophecy. And so Schreiner says, I think the tongues in Corinth was the same as the tongues in Acts. And here's what he says on page 130. This is strong language, but I like it and I agree with it. He says, virtually no tongue speaking today fits the biblical description of tongues, since people are not speaking in discernible languages. The contemporary, quote, gift doesn't match what is in the scriptures. That's a big claim, and a lot of people won't like it, but I think he is absolutely right. So he's talked about prophecy, he's talked about tongues, now he talks just about cessationism in general. And in chapter 10, he lays out unconvincing arguments for cessationism, just kind of acknowledging what people say and the ideas that are out there. Then in chapter 11, he lays out what he thinks is a convincing argument, his argument for cessationism. And here it is, just in summary form. He says, look, Paul believed Jesus was coming back soon, and Paul clearly believed that the gifts would end when Jesus came back. What Paul did not know, because he wasn't omniscient and God didn't tell him everything, he didn't know church history was going to stretch out over 2,000 years. And the Lord didn't reveal that information to Paul or the early church. He didn't tell them that the miraculous and the revelatory gifts would end with the apostles and the prophets. And he didn't tell any of them any of that because he didn't want any of them to know the actual time of Christ's return. He wanted them to live with a sense of imminence and urgency. So 1 Corinthians 13 says that gifts will end when Christ returns, but that doesn't mean that all the gifts have to last until Christ returns. The apostles were a foundational gift, a foundational office. Prophets were a foundational gift, a foundational office. That's Ephesians 2:20. That foundation has been laid, and so we no longer have apostles and prophets, but we do have evangelists and pastors and teachers to pull from Ephesians chapter 4. Here's a summary quote, favorite quote from the book, page 157. The basis for cessationism is the claim that the church was, quote, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Ephesians 2:20. We saw earlier that the prophets here are New Testament prophets. The word apostleship is used in a technical sense here, and Paul doesn't have in mind pioneering missionaries. He's talking about the 12 and maybe a few others who were included in that apostolic group. This is a pretty straightforward argument. It's built on the idea that Old Testament and New Testament prophecy is the same. It's built on the idea that prophecy and prophets went out with the apostles, their foundational gifts. And it's built on the idea that tongues is directly related to prophecy because it has to be translated, and when it's translated, it becomes prophecy. These miracles, these revelatory gifts were tied to the apostles in several New Testament texts, and I think this is a pretty convincing argument for cessationism. What's the ministry takeaway of this book? If you're a regular pastor, you are going to encounter this issue in your ministry. People will be at your church. They'll come from charismatic backgrounds. They'll come with questions. They'll come wanting to argue. They'll come relying on their experience over Scripture. They will come having not thought out these issues with any seriousness. And even your own people, because of the internet and the influence of social media, they're going to have impact by people who claim to be prophets, or people claim to be a prophet, or people claim to be gifted with the ability to perform miracles. So regular pastors need to think through these issues. I have no critique of this book. I like it. I think it presents a compelling case for cessationism, and it's an argument that I've really never read in this exact form anywhere else. I've read a lot of other arguments for cessationism, most of which I don't find particularly convincing, but this is one that I think fits with the biblical text. It fits with what the New Testament says about apostles and prophets and the foundational nature of these gifts, and I think it fits with the story of church history. The Goodreads rating for spiritual gifts is 418. I think that's ridiculously low. I'm sure there's some continuationists who have got on there and given it a low rating. I gave it a 5-star rating. I would have given it 6 if I could. I think this is a tremendous book, easy to read, straightforward, well thought out, and an argument that I think is convincing. Who should read it? I think pastors should read books like this just because the issue is going to come up in your church, whether you are part of a charismatic denomination or not. I think Christians who come from a charismatic background would do well to read a book like this. I think this is a kind critique towards charismatic theology and practice. So I think there's a helpful pushback here. And, you know, if you're just a Christian who's been influenced by or you've interacted with charismatics over the years, I think that this is a helpful book, and I've recommended it to many people who fall into that category. So that's the book, Spiritual Gifts by Thomas Schreiner. I cannot recommend it to you enough. Thanks for listening to the Regular Pastor Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen for weekly episodes here in Season 5. Appreciate an A+ rating, 5-star rating wherever you're at. You can follow Regular Pastor online, regularpastor.com, and you can find me on Goodreads. If you search for Landon Coleman, I'd love to know what you're reading. If you have a book recommendation or a request, let me know. Landon@emmanuelodessa.com. Until next week, this is the Regular Pastor, not the Regular Prophet.